All right, so this video is the start of the nutrition assessment and diagnosis. We're going to focus on diet. So obviously, you're training to be an RDN. I teach nutrition. Diet's kind of our game. So there's a lot of different methods to assess diet and nutrition. None of them are perfect. So it really depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to determine the content of food and appropriateness of the adequate intake for that patient or client, you may need one tool. If your goal is determining factors toward normal or related or typical eating, you may need another different tool. Or if you need to estimate exposure to food additives or contaminants, you'd probably want something even different. Other reasons why we may need a nutrition or diet history could be related to formulating or evaluating government health and agricultural policy, conducting epidemiological research, or for commercial purposes. The dietary assessment is important. We need to look at energy and macronutrient content, both acute, so that could be within the day, within the hour, and also chronic, over an entire lifetime. Keeping in mind that many deficiencies occur over a long period of time, and deficiencies can occur at different rates. So B12, we store a lot of it for a long time in the liver. Vitamin C, we don't store. So we'll need to continually take in vitamin C, where we can go periods without consuming vitamin B12, and we wouldn't have any problems. There's also subclinical deficiencies and clinical deficiencies. Subclinical deficiencies, we would see this mostly, say, in like vitamin D, maybe a moderate anemia, whereas a clinical deficiency is severe and chronic. This could be something like if you have an individual who has a substance use disorder, is using a lot of alcohol, and they have a thiamine deficiency that has then progressed into a neurological impairment. And the dietary assessment is important because, as we've hit time and time again in the biochemical lectures, that biochemical indices are rarely performed outside of a research setting. They're expensive, they can be difficult, and simple concentrations in serums, in the serum, do not reflect the intake or status for many nutrients. A diet assessment, on the other hand, may be able to detect early deficiencies. So some of our outpatient methods. We have the diet history. And in diet history, we have a couple of different options. So these are retrospective. Ooh. I don't know what happened right there. Okay. So we have diet history. These are retrospective. Meaning that we are looking back in time. So we have a 24-hour recall, food frequency, and food diaries or records. Sometimes these are like in the moment, but usually you're doing this even after you've eaten something. In the hospital, we have some different methods available. We can still do the 24-hour recall and food frequency, but we can also do an observation of the food intake or a calorie count. So food records or diet history through a food record is considered the gold standard for diet assessment. These are usually completed over a period of 3, 4, or even 7 days. As with most research and most data, the more the better. And food records provide detailed information about food products, and they eliminate the uncertainty of recalling foods eaten. I know you've heard me in class joke about my goldfish memory, but that's common for a lot of people. Even just remembering what you ate the previous day can be difficult, especially it's Halloween time right now. Think about how many times you might have just like picked up a piece of candy walking through the student union. It's hard to remember those little caloric intakes. The food record method replaces errors in recall, though, with errors in recording. And the respondents have to be highly motivated, they have to be literate, and they have to be well trained. And that's because when we're talking about how much food you've eaten or the type of food, it's easy to be vague. Say you ate a bowl of spaghetti. How big is that bowl? Well, my bowls at my home may be different than a bowl of spaghetti at a restaurant. When I make spaghetti at home, I may add garlic or onion into it, whereas someone else may not. So these are all the little details that you need to be able to capture with a food record, and this requires quite a bit of training. Weighed food records are the best option, but this requires that your participant has a scale in their home. The scale has to be accurate. They have to measure everything. It's rather tedious. So how many days are best? Like I said, really, the more, the better. But we really need to consider the number of days needed to estimate a true average for each individual nutrient. So we may have a good estimate for caloric intake, but we may not have a good estimate for iron intake over 3 days. And we have to think about if this nutrient changes day to day. So think about the difference between your own diet on weekends versus weekdays. Or Christmas is coming up. Do you often eat the same way during the Christmas holiday that you would in the middle of July? Even seasonally, the difference in foods available in the fall versus the spring. So we see that for energies, this is just kcals, of course. This is what most of our dietary recalls are looking at, how much energy people are consuming. It takes around 3 days to get a true average intake. However, if we want to really look at protein or fat or carbohydrate, we need more days. Now we're getting into 4 to 6 days. If we want to know more specific things like minerals, iron, calcium, sodium, we need almost a week. If we want something that's highly uneven, like vitamin C, for men, we need a whole month. We need a little bit less for women. Women tend to pay closer attention to their diet historically, therefore fewer days are needed. But if you're just doing a 3-day dietary recall, but you're trying to assess someone's vitamin C intake, you have not done nearly enough dietary intake or dietary recalls to accurately average that person's vitamin C concentration. Oh, and apologies, this is in a group. So if you're doing it for, I don't know, you're doing a population-based study or you're doing a study on all college freshmen, this is how many you would need. If you want it for an individual person, so now maybe you're in a clinical setting, maybe you are counseling someone, now you really need around 2 weeks 2 weeks of dietary recalls to get an average intake for an individual person. And it goes up from there. For our macronutrients, anywhere from a week to a month. For our minerals, again, around a month. For vitamin C for an individual, we need at least 3 months of data. So a diet history can include a 24-hour recall or a food frequency. And like I mentioned, these are retrospective. And these can also include peripheral information. We can ask about people's preferences. How much did you like this? We can ask about allergies. Important to know if someone has a dairy allergy. We can also ask about supplements and medications, appetite, GI function. We can do this pretty simply as how does your stomach feel? I'm going to say tummy because it's funner to write. We can ask about financial situations. This often is a very good way of detecting food security because you may notice patterns. Oh, they didn't eat this day because there was a lack of food, but they made up for it the next day. Additionally, living conditions and physical activity and lifestyle. So in diet history information, some information that is important to consider is allergies, intolerances, and avoidances. So why are these foods being avoided? Food avoidances can be tricky, especially when people tell you they have celiacs, but it's not diagnosed or self-diagnosed. They probably don't have celiacs. But you'll want to know a description of the problems caused by the foods. That way, you may need to evaluate further, okay, is this an actual allergy or is something else going on? Dental and oral health, especially in older adults. So they may not be able to chew the food adequately. There may be foods they can't eat because they lack the teeth. They may have problems with swallowing, salivation, food sticking to the inside of their mouth. Also, gastrointestinal factors. So do they often get heartburn, bloating, gas? Are they taking home remedies? Are they taking a lot of antacids or laxatives? Kind of obvious, but chronic disease. If someone is receiving chemotherapy for cancer treatment, they often have a decreased appetite. So if you are unaware that they have cancer, that's going to make your suggestions less relevant. Another common one is type 1 diabetes. If you don't know that someone has type 1 diabetes, it's really hard for you to determine dietary modifications, or why they are eating the way they are eating. It's also important to know what medications they might be on, and this includes over-the-counter and prescription. And we'll get into this much more in the medication and supplement sections, but vitamins and minerals and medications and macronutrients can all interact with each other. And then, has there been a recent weight change? Was this intentional or unintentional? And then perceived dietary problems. What does the patient, participant, client think about their diet? Additionally, it can be very useful to know the economics, the person's ethnic or cultural background, especially if you're going to start suggesting foods, home life and meal patterns. What is their job like? Do they work at night? What's their appetite like? And what's their general attitude? And this could even be what we now are calling eating competency. So let's go into the 24-hour recall. Like I mentioned, it's retrospective. It should indicate whether the intake and cooking method is typical. Some problems with the 24-hour recall: an atypical day. And this can be either increase or decrease calories due to an atypical day. Oops. Inability to recall is probably your biggest problem. Even if they are unaware, they're unable to recall. So I used to do 24-hour recalls with kids that were like 7 to 9 years old. I would ask them, hey, what did you eat during the day? What I would hear back: nothing. Oh, you didn't eat anything today, I would respond. Nope. And then in the background, I would hear their mom yelling, that's not true, you ate blah, 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 blah. So inability to recall is a real problem. In adults, it can be an inability to recall certain foods. I mentioned, you see a little bowl of candy, you have a couple of jelly beans. It's likely that you won't remember that. And then the intake of the patient can progress towards the mean, where they just remembered the same things over an average time of day. But people typically underreport, and there are sex differences. Females tend to underreport more. Some have an age group interaction, so adolescent males sometimes overreport, so they'll overestimate how much they ate. But this is why we need multiple recalls. One, people get better at recalling what they ate with practice. You'll get the progress to the mean, which is actually okay. And if you're using a software like the ASA24, people get used to it. They get better at using it. Ooh. I always write over where I'm about to have there. So some advantages, though. It might be really important to know the intake the day before, especially if you were an anesthesiologist. None of us are, and they don't ask that much, but it could be important to know when the last time you ate and exactly what you ate. The ability to recall the previous day may be all you need. But as with everything, more data is better. And if you can combine a 24-hour recall with a food frequency questionnaire, you can get even more data. So from 24-hour recalls, you can kind of estimate this from food frequency questionnaires, but it's more difficult. We have the Healthy Eating Index, or the HEI. And the Healthy Eating Index is really nice because it's scored against the benchmark of the U.S. dietary guidelines. So the HEI is comparing an individual person's diet to the U.S. dietary guidelines. Another really nice thing is the scores range from 0 to 100, and you can even think of them in the same way that you would think of grades. An A is 90 to 100, B 80 to 89, C 70 to 79, so on and so forth. The Healthy Eating Index is made up of 13 components that reflect the different food groups and key recommendations in the 2015 to 2020 guidelines for Americans. And they update these every 5 years. Right now, it is only validated in older adults or older children and adults. They do now have a 2-year-old Healthy Eating Index. It gets tricky in infants and children who are still breastfeeding because it, as you can imagine, is difficult to quantify how much breast milk a child is consuming. But what's really nice for this is that we're creating standards. Oops, sorry, my hand is messing this up. But we're creating standards. So we know the average healthy eating index for the US. We can compare an individual to an average. And this gives context for our patient, client, participant. And we can actually easily look up the reports here. So I mentioned it was made up of 13 components. These are made up of two groups. Adequacy components, these represent food groups, subgroups, and dietary elements that we want people to eat, that are encouraged. So we want higher scores that reflect higher intakes, because the higher intake is desirable. So these are things like whole grains, protein, fruits and vegetables, but we also have moderation components. These are food groups and dietary elements that we want to limit. So for moderation components, higher scores reflect lower intakes because lower intakes are more desirable. These are things like added sugar, or saturated fat, or sodium. So this is the 2015 components and scoring standards. I think they may have come up with a 2020, but they're not too different, so I haven't changed this slide yet. But here we see our adequacy components. Total fruits, whole fruits, total vegetables, greens and beans, which is not the same as green beans. This is like leafy greens. Dairy, total protein, seafood and plant proteins, and a fatty acid ratio. You'll also notice the points. So for fruits, which is two categories, we have total fruits, whole fruits, both are equal to 5, so the total fruit category is worth 10. Similarly, vegetables and greens and beans, both worth 5. We can combine these to be a group of 10. Whole grains is a 10. Dairy, 10. Proteins made up of two components, you add those together, 10. Then we have our moderation components: refined grains, sodium, added sugars, and saturated fats. And so again, lower intakes equal better score. So you'd have a perfect 10 if you ate less than 1.8 ounces per 1,000 calories. That's how you would get the maximum score. You would get the lowest score of 0 if you ate more than 4.3 ounces of refined grains. So again, if we look over here, we get the maximum score for total fruits if you eat more than 0.8 cups per 1,000 calories. You get a 0 if you ate no fruit. The kind of unusual one is the fatty acids. So this isn't a ratio. We have the ratio of polyunsaturated fatty acids plus monounsaturated fatty acids divided by saturated fatty acids. And we want this ratio to be better than 2.5. Think about a ratio. It's a numerator over a denominator. And we want the numerator to be big in this case. We want it, actually, the numerator to be 2.5 times bigger, not digger, bigger. So we want to eat 2.5 times more MUFAs and PUFAs. Then saturated fats. So now we're going to move on to the food frequency questionnaires. Food frequency questionnaires ask things like, in the last 6 months, how many cups of milk have you drank? And they'll often give you 0 to 6, 6 to 12, something like that. They ask how often you're consuming something. What's nice about this is an RD can tailor it to a case. Maybe you're concerned about iodine. Well, you may not need a whole 24-hour recall. You may need to just focus on iodized salt intake, seafood, what other iodine sources? Cruciferous vegetables. So you may just need a food frequency questionnaire that looks at these aspects. And a food frequency questionnaire can identify potential deficiencies in intakes. But the problems with them are that food patterns may change during an illness, and the focus is on food groups, not necessarily specific nutrients, unless you're creating one specifically for a nutrient. And some important data, like the timing of meals, is not obtained. We also would have a hard time determining something like food security, because it's usually we ask over the course of the last 3 weeks or months. So this was a study that looked at the pooled results from 5 validation studies. So it's a study looking at studies, a meta-analysis, of dietary self-report instruments, and they used recovery biomarkers for energy and protein intake. So they pooled data from 5 large validation studies that used recovery biomarkers as references to clarify the measurement properties of food frequency questionnaires and 24-hour recalls. Using a food frequency questionnaire, the average correlation coefficient, so remember, a correlation coefficient is it's very similar to a line. If it's positive, it means that they both increase together. If it's negative, it means as one increases, one decreases. So these are all positive, so they're positively correlated. They're both increasing together. But these are fairly low correlation coefficients. So for energy, it was 0.21. For protein, it was 0.29. And for protein density, it was 0.41. For reference, a good correlation coefficient is around 0.8. Using a single 24-hour recall, we see fairly similar results for energy. A single 24-hour recall correlated with calorie intake at a pretty low level, 0.26. It was slightly better for protein, but actually slightly worse than the food frequency questionnaire on protein density. When 3 24-hour recalls were used, the correlation coefficients increased to 0.31, 0.49, and 0.46 respectively. But again, if we're considering what a good correlation coefficient is, these are still well below what we would consider a good or a strong correlation. So like I mentioned, food frequency questionnaires can be simple, they can be semi-quantitative or fully quantitative. And there's several validated food frequency questionnaires. You'll often see use of the Block food frequency questionnaire, the Willett food frequency questionnaire, the NCI quick food scan, and then also the NHANES. They can also be customized for the population of interest. So this would be a very general food frequency questionnaire. Do you drink milk? If so, how much? Do you use fat? If so, how much? You can see how these are very broad questions. And a lot of people, even with similar diets, may answer them differently. So next we have the observation or calorie count. And this is really only appropriate in a hospital or very specific research. You won't see this in outpatient. So it can be called a calorie count or a calorie protein count, and the purpose is to determine intake by mouth and prevent problems with specific foods. And since this is in a hospital setting, it often involves a team, the RDN, registered nurse, nurse practitioners, food service, and this also often falls on a family member. So this is the Abbott Dietary Intake Guide. You're in a hospital setting, so you're giving someone a tray of food. And you know exactly how much food is in each part of the tray. So if everything on the tray is consumed, you can say that everything was eaten. You could also weigh the tray, but this is just using a visual inspection. Good dietary intake would be 75% of the food is consumed. Fair, 50%, poor, 25%, and if nothing is eaten on the tray, then 0 was consumed. But things you have to keep in mind is that, did a family member eat anything? Was something thrown away? You also may need to consider if they have had like an Ensure or a Glucerna. So other methods that are developing are photography to record dietary intake. This is getting better with the advent of better AI, but still not that great.